Good morning. I'm here to share with you research that we've conducted for a project about the future of work. The Committee for Perth is WA's leading independent think tank, and we've sought to understand the impacts of the global pandemic as well as the global forces of change to what that means for the future of work, for people, for workplaces, for organisations, for industries and for government. So in terms of where has industry come from, because that's the major driving force for work. So since 1784, we've been undergoing a wave of industrial revolution as more progress, more automation, more technology comes to the fore. And we're sitting now at this confluence between Industry 3.0, which was all about the computerisation of things, and Industry 4.0, we're going to the Internet of Things. So why don't we go to the first industrial city in the world, Manchester. And I'm sure that these images are quite familiar to you. The factory with the smokestack blowing out right in the heart of the city and its workforce co-located around the periphery. And of course, that drove a period of time where people actually fled cities and went to the suburbs in search of a better quality of life. Looking at a region that has really exponentially shaped the globe as we currently know it in terms of modern tech, you've got San Francisco to the north, the more historic city, and San Jose to the south. And this valley in between is flooded with tech companies, many of them brand names that you would recognise. So let's have a look at the fourth industrial revolution in terms of where that sits with global megatrends and COVID-19 itself. So we're sitting here with technology, AI, robotics, sensors, data in the industrial revolution space. And then we're overlaying that with global economic, demographic, socio-economic, environmental, geopolitical trends, such as population ageing, labour force change, shifting workforce structure, climate change and urbanism. And how are those two things working almost as disruptive forces, so to speak? How are they going to impact work, the workforce and the workplace? In terms of work, we expect things like a reshaping of demand for and supply of services, products and jobs. In terms of workforce impacts, changing workforce size, demographic and skill sets. And workplace, gig economy, part-time and casual work will shape the sort of workplace more broadly, as well as remote and hybrid work. So if we think about automation being the big driving force in Industry 4.0, let's have a look at what the experts say in terms of how many jobs are really susceptible to change. And if you look at the axes down the far right, that is all of the timeframes, and then on the bottom is all of the companies that have had a go at sizing. And as you can see, there's very little agreement, everything from a small amount of change to a large amount of change. So an organisation like PwC, sitting in the more sort of conservative side of things, the Brookings Institute actually thinking that there will be more jobs displaced. What are the industries least susceptible to technological change? Education and health, very prominent, closely followed by ICT and computer science. When we look at industries most susceptible to automation and technological change, in first and second place is manufacturing and transport, but I thought you would be interested in this audience that construction is fourth placed, and I'll come back and mention construction again. So for our Future of Work project, where we're very much focused on Western Australia, we conducted a large-scale community survey through Ipsos, our research partner. And as you can see, all of the green elements ranked are very much about embracing technology, technology being part of making life and work easier. But when you look in the red zone, particularly at the top of the red zone, people are worried that there will be a reduced number of jobs due to technological change and the adaptation of machines over people. So let's have a look at the growth of employment by state since 1984 in the country. And in this table, you've got two measures. One is from 1984 to 2019, so the long-term view, and then a more short-term view, 2009 to 2019. The Australian average over the long run is 2.79% of employment growth, with Queensland over the long run being the major driving force, followed by Western Australia and Victoria. But if you take a slice just over the last decade, where the average has been for Australia at 2%, we've actually got Victoria in first place and New South Wales in second. So it does go to show where you're measuring it over what period of time as to what is instructive. We've also looked at the proportional growth of employment in key sectors in Australia over that long run, and there's variable fortunes. So there certainly has been growth in healthcare and social assistance at 5.51%. And second place, professional, scientific and technical services. But there has been losses in wholesale trade. So we've certainly had some volatility in key sectors in our employment market. When we look at the period from 2019 to 2024, there were projections moving forward about where the employment growth would come from. And healthcare and social assistance is considered to be a large employer into the future, as is professional, scientific and technical services. But coming back to construction, also fourth placed. Of course, these measures were taken in a pre-COVID world. We have a look at jobs growth by capital city. Greater Melbourne is first placed, followed by Greater Sydney, Greater Brisbane, with Adelaide and Perth sitting in fourth place. I can tell you, sitting in Western Australia at the moment when we have an abject skills shortage, it certainly doesn't feel like we're going to be in fourth place. In terms of interstate and intrastate migration, interesting to look at the COVID impacts from the period of September 2019, when we had no COVID at all, and September 2020, when we've been living with it for about 6 to 7 months. And we have heard about this exodus out of the major capitals, not just in Australia, but across the developed world. And you can see there that Sydney and Melbourne have experienced losses, whereas Brisbane and Perth have experienced gains. I think this news article from ABC last year really captures the sentiment of people fleeing the major capitals. So major capitals losing some population, particularly on the East Coast, into those regional capitals, so well out of the metropolitan area and more into the hinterland proper. And what we're seeing is, almost 12 months on from that period when this report came out, is a lack of affordable housing, shortage of rentals, schools full, etc. And that's certainly the case in Dunsborough in the southwest of Western Australia. So a lot of the knowledge workers have decamped out of Perth, have been able to use technology to stay connected, and apparently you can't buy a house there, you can't get a child into school, and the town feels particularly full. COVID's had a lot of impacts, and this is a slide from last year, and I'm sure the figures have changed quite dramatically since. But I think it's illustrative to see that the red block says, yes, I actually have a preference to shop online, and the dark grey, no, I don't. And there's more of a preference to shop online from New South Wales and Victoria than there is from South Australia and Western Australia. Fortunately, we've had a colleague, Dr. Paul McGinn at the University of Western Australia, actually working on tracking this. And so this graph shows the monthly change in visitors to retail and recreation spaces by capital city LGA from February right through until the end of July this year. Sydney is in the purple, Brisbane in the yellow, Adelaide in the blue, Melbourne in the red, and Perth the dotted black. And as you can see from that very first lockdown, which was sharp and sudden, where basically the whole country was taking measures at the same time. The downward trajectory was very dramatic, and then you can see the various lockdowns and the impacts thereof, and of course Sydney the most dramatic at the moment in purple, falling off a cliff over the last few months. Coming back to our Future of Work survey, I think this is illustrative not just of what we found in Western Australian employers, but I'm sure elsewhere as well. You can see in this graph that 5 to 10 years ago, or even 1 to 5 years ago, or just even pre-COVID, there was a small amount of the workforce working at home. So this was probably playing out at something like about 1 day a week. Right now, and moving forward, it's projected that, about half the workforce at any given time, or maybe even more, will be working away from the office. So this sense of agile working. And you can see that on the right there, we have surveyed some of Perth's largest employers, and there is a strong sort of sentiment that they will keep flexible working arrangements moving forward. So Paul McGinn has also tracked visitors to workplaces right up until the end of July this year. And as you can see, again, that first lockdown, the very steep curve, and then ongoing sort of volatility as and when lockdowns occur, and the most dramatic in Sydney playing out right now. Of course, that then has an effect on what's time spent in residential places, and you can see quite the reverse is happening. So in Sydney, more people at home, and if you look back at the previous graph, less people in the office. And so you can see that very first curve working in the opposite direction in lockdown, pretty much everybody at home that could be. And of course, there has been some contention about frontline and essential workers still having to turn up at their place of work every day, whereas knowledge workers having the ability to work from home. Paul's been also interested in the effect on transit, and so he's tracked that too. And as you can see, public transport use dropped off at the first lockdown, has continued to be volatile ever since. And, here in Perth, you do see people on the trains and in buses, but you're also seeing a propensity for personal mobility, scooters, cycling, which has always been very popular here, and more people in their cars. So Hassel, one of our members, has put out what they think is a way of thinking through what the workplace might be into the future, because of course that's going to impact places of work, centres of work. So on the left, as it was, basically no change. At some point in the future, we'll all be vaccinated, COVID will have been eradicated, and we'll go back to the way things were before. And on the far right, no office. That people will just work where they need to work, they will make their own minds up about that, and there will not be a sort of central place to come to work. Most likely is these hybrid models in the middle, and typically of scenarios it might be a bit of each. So there's a sense of turbocharged working from home, but they will no longer have an assigned desk, but will still come back to the office as and when required. The clubhouse will be that really collaborative place where you will come not only to share and learn with each other, but also problem solve. And the hub and spoke model, where you'll have a short commute to a place that you can work from that's very close to home rather than coming into a CBD. And of course, each of these from the middle and the right have an impact on CBDs, which I'll talk about more broadly in a minute. So coming back to where does Australia sit? We have 4 of the 10 most livable cities in the world. Adelaide at 3rd place, Perth at 6th, Melbourne at 9th, and Brisbane at 10th. And I can tell you, being the world's most livable city is something that city makers and shapers aspire for, but particularly decision makers. So Auckland is sitting at 1st place. Melbourne has been there, so too has Vienna and Vancouver over the last decade. And Sydney's acutely feel it when they're no longer the world's most livable. When we look at the EIU rankings, which are sitting at the top of this table, I've also given you a flavour of others. And what it just goes to show is it depends on what you're measuring as to where Australian capital cities rank. And if you go down to the QS Best Student Cities in 2019, you can see that Melbourne is best placed in the country at number 3. But when you're looking at the Resonance World's Best City Brands in 2021, Sydney is actually best placed. And of course, each of the Australian capitals has their fair share of good rankings, but not necessarily absolutely at the top in any. I thought it might also be instructive to have a look at the world's most economically powerful cities. And what you can see is the ranking on the left, the city, the country, and then their economic power. And that's really where we're sort of getting that measure from. And you can see London, New York, Tokyo, Paris, etc., cities that you would expect. But if you go a little bit further over on the rankings, you can see that quality of life, the second column in from the right, not so high. And there is a tension between being a city of renown for commerce and being livable as well. And typically you tend to find that their livability does get eroded. Colleagues at Loughborough University have placed these world cities in a ranking, Alpha being the most prominent, Beta, second string, giving the first cities a run for their money over time, and Gamma more the sort of developing cities. And as you can see, the alpha cities that we would expect to be there are New York, Paris, Tokyo, London, Singapore, etc. So I'm going to reflect on a couple of those cities now and see where they think they are at. So Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, in a 2021 4th of May report says, boomerang Londoners will return post-pandemic. And then if we look at the New York Post, the headline from July this year is pandemic mass exodus is slowly reversing in Manhattan. So I would suggest that both of those are talking very much about going back to business as usual. Powerhouse cities that have experienced a little blip in time, a global pandemic. They've certainly experienced them before, both of those cities, and bounced back from them. But let's have a look at what Paris has been doing. Paris was facing a mayoral election during COVID, and I think they have wisely used COVID as a point of leverage in their political system to talk about the greater metropolis of Paris, the place we all know and love, and what would it be like? What changes could they systemically make to their city? And they've really grounded this concept of a 15 to 20 minute city where you can live and within 15 to 20 minutes of either walking, cycling, or an easy public transport commute, get access to most of the services and amenities that you need for everyday life. So that real sense of localism coming in. So they're not so much worried about brand Paris, but they're really worried about quality of life for their residents, and I think a very wise move. Let's turn to Singapore. The Straits Times reported recently that in a post-pandemic world, Singapore accepts it will be different, but their fundamental goals will not change. So they remain resolute that they want to be valuable to the global economy, but also build a fairer and more inclusive society. And so they are saying, okay, we understand change is afoot, but we've got some things that are embedded in our political and civic society, and we want to remain true to those values and to the goals in a post-pandemic world. So in summary, global headwinds, technology and the pandemic have accelerated the rates of change. As a result, we believe there is no going back to business as usual, and work, the workplace and the workforce will undergo a period of recalibration. Industry 4.0 has the potential to be transformative, not the least of which being more productive with less environmental footprint. But as a result, some parts of our community may be left behind. People who've been trained for the jobs of the past may not necessarily be adaptable to the jobs of the future. Technology, previously used as an enabler, and you saw that very much in our Future of Work survey results, it may become a displacer. As a result, people will need to commit to lifelong learning, and the education sector will need to have to adjust accordingly. So this sense of having a baseline skill and how do you keep adjusting and finessing your skill set so that you can remain employable. Organisations and their leaders, it's fair to say, have been struggling to develop fair and equitable policies that meet the needs of their entire workforce. What we mean by this is you've got frontline workers, essential workers, as well as knowledge workers, all in your workforce. And how do you create a set of policies that meet the needs of all of those? And as a result, there are competitive forces at play. So the companies that get this right will become the employers of choice. Working from home has become a catalyst for localism. We've certainly seen that here in Perth. But what it means is that the CBDs have been dying as a result of a lack of critical mass, and Perth has the highest return to office workforce in the country, yet there are days when it still feels very quiet, and I'm sure on the East Coast, looking at the news reports, those city centres feel quite desperate. But our suburban centres really are flourishing, and so what will be the new balance moving forward will be partly determined by work. My biggest disclaimer is we are in the midst of a global pandemic, and as a result, the impacts cannot be fully understood, particularly over the long term. I think we are all adjusting as and when changes are afoot, not the least of which are these sudden lockdowns, the Northern Territory finding itself in that position only yesterday. So there is much yet to understand about the future of work and how that will play out and disrupt cities into the future. Thank you.